Now let's take a quick look at how to do motion blur in Arnold. Now motion blur is a great way to blur fast-moving objects to make them look more realistic. So we can get to motion blur in one of two places. So if I go into select camera from my viewport and go into the attribute editor, I should be able to scroll down to my Arnold tab. And then at the very bottom here, we have camera motion blur. Now I can turn it on or off here, but typically this is set to use global settings. So let's go ahead and set that in the actual render settings window. So I'm going to go into display render settings. And so that we can see the effect, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick Arnold render view and go run IPR. So now here we have our scene. So if we turn on motion blur, we can immediately see an effect. Now there are a couple of options here. One is deformation. So if the object is deforming, do you want to motion blur that deformation? And typically the answer is yes, but if you're animating just solid objects, you'll get a little bit more speed if you click it off. The other one is camera. Do you want the motion of the camera to create motion blur? So if the camera is moving, is that factored into the equation? And then finally, the number of keys. So this is actually our quality setting. So if I turn this down, you'll see that this is only doing 2 keys. So in other words, it's only doing the frame before and the frame after. If we want, we can dial this up a little bit more to get more resolution. Now when I do this, notice what happens in this viewport here. I'm going to go ahead and move this down here. So when I move this down, notice how this is moving here. So what it's doing is it's actually moving between the start of the first frame and the end frame. So it's really just moving that object through that one range of frames. So through that 24th of a second in this case. And then it blurs all of that together. Now the next thing we can control is where the motion blur starts. Does it start on the frame? Does it center on the frame? Now notice how this moves back a little bit. So if we start on frame, then it starts the motion blur from the start of the frame. In the middle, it basically places the object in the middle of that 24th of a second and blurs before and after. And then at the end, it goes back to the end of the frame and blurs forward. And again, we can also do the length of the blur. So at 0, there is no motion blur. And then this determines how much of this frame is blurred. Now notice this also corresponds to a shutter angle. And this is important if you're working with film. So typically the shutter angle is going to be about 180 degrees, and 0.5 will get you exactly at 180 degrees. So those are some of the basics of how to do motion blur in Arnold.